Hi, this is Talia from Talia Nerds Out. Welcome to my channel. If this is your first time coming here. Still recording off of my phone, although I finally found a way to prop it so it's not wildly moving all over the place while I'm recording. Just don't quite feel up to doing a video at my desk yet. This is only supposed to be, we'll see how it goes. It's only supposed to be a short video. It was requested by Janelle of, sorry, my brain just died. Too Fond of Books, that I put up something regarding the a book that I mentioned during one of her sprints that I happened to be reading at the time. And that book is called Maids, Wives, and Widows. And I've been reading this book for a little while. And honestly, I have thoroughly enjoyed it. First of all, let me bring up the cover, because I was doing it off of my Kindle. Sorry, something on my screen. So this is the cover. It's by Sarah Reed, exploring early modern women's lives, 1540 to 1740. And I found this book to be highly enjoyable, highly interesting. I'm interested in English history anyway, and this is focused particularly on English history. I believe that is what Sarah Reed generally tends to focus on. I'm not quite sure. I feel like I have a couple of her books, but I'm not completely certain on that. But this one does happen to be focused on English women's history during the 1540 to 1740 time period. And it does a very good job of really covering a whole host of things about women's lives during that period, to the point where you feel like you really get a comprehensive view, but not in such a way that's like rote or boring. I kept finding myself saying things like, oh wow, or oh that's interesting, as I was reading through the book. Things about how women were involved politically, some of them quite daringly politically, how women were involved religiously, even to the point of being religious leaders in ways that would have been considered shocking then. Women mystics. There was talk about women dealing with health issues and how they saw women's health during that time period. How women worked within the structures of that time with the limitations they had, while still trying to forge forward to make better lives for themselves. They also talked about women writers, both as playwrights, poets, women businessmen. I believe they even touched on one or two women who owned their own property as well, because they were widows. I believe that one of the businesswomen had that, where she owned the business in and of herself, and there really wasn't much of a, I mean, she did marry again, but I think after he died, I don't think she looked for another husband, because she had what she wanted. She had her business. No one could take that from her because it was hers. But yeah, I found it to be quite interesting, quite comprehensive. I felt like it was a very, very thorough, and it covered both ends. So like it would cover first, let's say you were dealing with the religious issues. So it would cover Protestant martyrs, but also cover the Catholic end of things. It would cover, women who would help smuggle the priests into I think they're called both holds or hidey holds. And then the women who would, who kept pushing things farther and farther for the Protestant Reformation in England. So like pushing what they did and did not believe farther and farther away from Catholicism, and then the reactions that they got for that. Leaders in the Quaker movement. Just very fascinating. And then just, things that you don't necessarily think about, how women would deal with certain everyday things. So yeah, I really, really enjoyed this book. Any book that makes me sit there and verbally go, oh wow, that's interesting, um, honestly deserves a 5-star rating, because I was constantly stopping from what I was reading, looking up and being like, oh wow, that's really interesting. I've highlighted things just for, um, it's nothing serious, but my mom and I write a story that we've been writing, gosh, it's got to be going on 15 years right now, a shared story. She writes her characters, I write my characters, and they interact, but it's in a medieval type setting. Now that's an era that's prior to this, but this gives me some food for thought when I'm dealing with my women characters. Like, okay, these are the things that would have been available to them. Yes, this is a different world, this is a different system, because it's our world, our system, we have magic, whatever. It doesn't have to be the same, but since we are trying to do a medieval type setting, some of these things I felt gave me some background and were quite useful. Besides which, I always feel like it's important to know what came before, how far things have come. And honestly, I enjoyed seeing where you'd also see some of the men coming to the bat. It's like, hey, some of these ideas that are really absurd, about thinking that, I think there's some guys who really, like, they would write that, I want to say some of them didn't even think women had souls, and there'd be guys that'd be like, no, that's dumb. They had the same intellect and all that, they just happen to have a different body. But it was interesting that it wasn't just the women speaking out for themselves, you'd also have the men that would speak out for them. So very interesting. And you'd see some of the same names come up quite a bit for women who were outspoken, particularly in certain areas. I noticed this particularly in like ones who would write. But yeah, I'm not sure what else I could say about this book other than do really check it out if you are at all interested in the topic of English history in general, but if you particularly are interested in women's history, or the place of women in history, if that makes sense. But as I was rating this on Goodreads, as Goodreads does, they will say on the bottom, and this is a very bad thing for me, just like the Amazon recommends is a very bad thing for me. It says, if you enjoyed this, these are some other books. And immediately, the first book on the list, well, first of all, I checked on to see if it was available on Kindle, and it was. But then I went and I was like, I'll be good. I will check and see if this is available on one of my library apps. So I checked first on my one that has a slightly longer time period where I can borrow the book. Now, this book is only, how many pages? 208 pages. So it shouldn't, if I actually sit there and read it instead of like dawdling, I should be able to get through quite quickly. But the book is, I'll show you the cover and then I'll read the description. Okay, so this is the book. Sorry, there we go. And haven't started yet, but I will. Okay, it's Exploring Health and Healing, 1540 to 1740. So it's the same time period that's covered for maids, wives, and widows. And maybe this is Sarah Reed's particular area of expertise. Now, this isn't just Sarah Reed. This time it's Sarah Reed and Jennifer Evans. Jennifer Evans' name is actually first. I'm wondering if she is the one with the medical background and Sarah Reed is just kind of filling things in. I don't know. But this will be the first time I see something with Jennifer Evans, whereas this is at least the second time for Sarah Reed, if not more. But Maladys in Medicine offers a lively exploration of health and medical cures in early modern England. The introduction sets out the background in which the body was understood, covering the theory of the four humors. I think they were moving away from the four humors at that point. I'm not sure, though. I'll find out. and the ways that male and female bodies were conceptualized. It also explains the hierarchy of healers from university-trained physicians, oh, interesting, to the itinerant women healers who traveled the country offering cures based on inherited knowledge and of homemade remedies. Cures based on inherited knowledge of homemade remedies. It covers the print explosion of medical health guides, which began to appear in the 16th century from more academic medical texts to books. From more academic medical textbooks to cheap almanacs. And actually, almanacs are covered in Maids, Wives, and Widows, as are some of the medical tracts, because there was two medical tracts that were frequently referenced in regards to women. One by a woman, one by a man, who were both, like, very common sense. There's another one that they would, at least one other one that'd be like, no, this one's stupid. But this one man and this one woman they kept referring to in a good way. And in some ways, they actually showed where he was a little bit more forward-thinking even than she was. But the book has 20 chapters covering attitudes towards and explanations of some of the most common diseases and medical conditions in the period and the ways people understood them, along with the steps people took to get better. It explores the body from head to toe, from migraines to gout. Oh, this is so interesting. It was an era when tooth cavities were thought to be covered by tiny worms. They actually used to brush their teeth with sugar. I forget where I heard that. Yeah, they used to brush their teeth with sugar, and then they wondered why they had cavities because they didn't understand how that worked. But I think they thought that the graininess would help. Anyway, because they used to do sand as well. And ways people understood them, along with the steps people took it better. Explore ways of that. Used to thought tooth cavities were caused by tiny worms and smallpox by an inflammation of the blood, and cures range from herbal potions, cooling cordials, blistering the skin, and of course, letting blood. Case studies and personal anecdotes from doctor's notes, personal journals, diaries, letters, and even court records show the reactions of individuals to their illnesses and treatments, bringing the reader in close proximity with people who lived around 400 years ago. This fascinating and richly illustrated study will appeal to anyone curious about the history of the body and the way our ancestors lived. So if you know anything about my channel, I think that you know pretty much two things. And I am looking around for something. Okay. You know that I love, well, you might know three things. I love classic literature, particularly British classic literature. I love English history, and I love medical history. This book combines medical and my love of history and my love of medical history in particular. So I'm really interested in this. It's going to push back a little bit, the one that I blame Too Fond of Books. I picked this up because she was reading this during her last reading sprints, The Last Days of Henry VIII, and it apparently covers some of the medical stuff and what they think he might have had. Now, the print is tiny on this, so this one might wait until I'm not having so much fatigue and sleeping so much, but I am looking forward to this. This sounds right up my alley. Tutor history was one of the first things that I started reading when I got into history. I think I started with Alison Weir's The Children of Henry VIII and haven't really looked back. But, so this is returning a little bit to my roots for reading history. And this is by Robert Hutchinson. So those are two TBRs that I am looking forward to. And a quick note before I sign off. I think I mentioned last time that I have two things actually to mention. Where did I put the other? There it is. I think I had mentioned last time that I had two books I wanted to finish. I wanted to finish Return of the King. No, wait, I mentioned I finished Return of the King. That's right. So I mentioned that, and I already did that. But I also had mentioned last time or the time before that I wanted to finish Lady Susan, the Juvenilia, and the Unfinished Works. I finished that. And I do feel that there's a definite difference between her main six novels, Jane Austen's main six novels, and Lady Susan, apart from her juvenilia and the unfinished works. Lady Susan and the 6 main novels feel more polished, and they have that Jane Austen flair and style and humor, the irony and the kind of like, almost like she's snidely like going at people's idiocies at times, where she's just kind of like poking at her social conventions and being like, isn't this stupid? Aren't people absurd? But where she has that in juvenilia and her unfinished works, it's not as polished. Juvenilia, most likely because she was quite young, even though I really did enjoy her history of England. That was rather hilarious. But that was probably my favorite of her juvenilia. For the uncompleted works, I believe, let's see, it was Sanditon and the Watsons. I think I would have enjoyed seeing the end of the Watsons. The Watsons, some of the characters had the dysfunctionality that I felt you saw in Persuasion, but without having the class. So I felt that the one sister who was sickly, or who's kind of irritable, that's what the word I was looking for, who's irritable and who thought that the one guy that everyone seemed to like, she was convinced he was like adored her, but she was just a really awful person spending time with when not trying to like get his attention, because she was just a miserable person. She felt to a certain extent to me like Mary from Persuasion. Just some of the, just general always being in a state of irritation. But I got to the point where I really was interested in seeing how the plot advanced. I had a inkling of where characters would end, and I wanted to see it get to that point. So I really was invested in the Watsons, and I'm sorry she didn't get a chance to finish that. Or either that she didn't get a chance, or that she chose not to for whatever reason. Sanditon, I had a lot more of a difficulty getting into. Part of it was one of the characters. He's very much flighty and thinks, well, first of all, he thinks he's some, stud who, he thinks he's one of those heartbreaker types that he's like, could just go and woo someone, and like, he thinks he's a bad boy is what it is. But he just goes off on these long, like, not even a rant. It's just this long monologue where he's basically saying nothing. And it's very hard for me to focus, because when you read through, like, what in the world are you saying, man? And I think that Jane Austen intended that, but it made it very hard for me to focus, because I couldn't get beyond the fact that he was just really just not saying anything. But yeah, I had more trouble getting attached to characters in that. And I had a lot more trouble getting invested in that plot. But I also think she didn't get as far along in that plot maybe as she did in the Watsons. She set the Watsons up a lot earlier. And I felt like you start off more with a bang, and you got to know characters a little more quickly. The scene was set for the main plot a lot more quickly, almost in the way that it was in Northanger Abbey. I felt like it almost had, at the beginning, that kind of feel of how they set it up. Okay, where, this person is coming to this new place, and they're going to a ball, and that's where things start. So, yeah, I was able to get a lot more into that. This video is already longer than I intended, but, yes. Oh, I don't think I said, started Silmarillion. I think I mentioned that last time. Not very far along. I am enjoying it, but this is, the text is small on this, so this really can only be read if I'm having a really good day and, have the ability to focus on it. Now that I'm used to it, it's hard. You have to be in the mindset that you're reading myth, and the style is very different than reading Lord of the Rings or anything that's in a more narrative style. This is a mythological style. And going into that has really, with that mindset has really helped. But, oh, since I finished Lady Susan, Juvenilia, Uncompleted Works, I started Mansfield Park. Initially I was going to start Persuasion because I watched something about the most recent, I think it was a Netflix, or I think it was Netflix, maybe someone else, who did something on a movie on Persuasion and really gave a poor treatment to, sorry, my brain's not working, probably because of the light. But anyhow, I love this character too. Why can't I remember her name? I should be able to because it's not that hard. Sorry, whoops. Anne. Why can't I remember the main character's name? It was so simple. My brain just wasn't working. I blame it on the lights. I don't always do well with light, hence migraine glasses. But they treated the Anne character very poorly because of modern media's inability to understand that there are different kinds of strong female characters and that there's a diversity of women characters who are interesting and wonderful and awesome. They all have to be the same, apparently. So they gave her very poor treatment, and I was going to read Persuasion next. But then I ended up watching a couple of Defense of Fanny Price videos. One covered a very talked very quickly, very blah, 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 gave a very quick coverage of the way Fanny was given the same treatment, I guess, that Anne was in her own movie at one point. And it was a very quick, she mentioned, and then she went on to a defense of the Fanny Price character. And I've been meaning to reread Mansfield Park. This has never been my favorite of her novels, but I do appreciate the Fanny Price character. She has a lot of depth. She is really an interesting character who in how she deals with everything she has to deal with. The Mrs. Norris character is delightfully awful. Not in the same way that Lady Susan, who is truly delightfully awful. Lady Susan's delightfully awful in a way that you can't wait to see what manipulative thing she's going to do next. And she's just so amazing in her awfulness. Mrs. Norris is just petty. She's petty and she's mean, and she just gets some sort of sick delight out of bringing Fanny down. And so this is a novel with that very, so you have that, you have a couple of very interesting issues that are brought up about where the money comes from for the family, just how people will deceive themselves about what happens when people enter into marriages for money alone versus love, what some of the side effects can be, just the effects of when certain actions fall on, the fallback comes on some people more than others. It's very interesting. Oh, and it also covers the bad boy girl, good girl trope in here, without ruining too much of that. I guess it wasn't even a trope back then, but I think there's very deep characters in here, even though I don't particularly like, I think it's Edmund in this one, because I always forget if it's Edmund or Edward in this one, because I don't particularly like the even though I understand where he comes from in Sense and Sensibility, he's not my favorite either. And I think he's Edward. I think this one's Edmund. Let's see. Yeah, this one's Edmund. But even though Edmund is probably actually he might be my least favorite of the love interests. But he has what's important for him. He has his good points, even though he definitely has his weaknesses. And I think every character is shown with their different depths. Yeah. And I think it's interesting, this is her thickest book. Pretty sure this is her thickest. No, I'm pretty sure this is her thickest, yeah. So, looking forward to going through this again. I think that Fanny does deserve to have a book this big because she's not obviously a character who would you'd be able to tell her story quickly. Her story is one that you had to see develop over the years. Even though equally, oh, there it is. In Persuasion, you also don't have your typical heroine. Anne Elliot is not, you know, Elizabeth Bennett, who's sassing her way across the page. And even though I appreciate Lizzie's humor and all that, upon, you know, multiple reads, I've come to the point where I see and I'll almost get irritated by Lizzie's determined refusal to see anything but that which she wishes to see. That doesn't, even though that is something that it does occur, I don't find that necessarily irritating because we all do that. What bothers me more about the Lizzie character that I didn't necessarily pick up until later readings or thought about until later readings is the way she tends to look at situations with a judgmental eye, much like her father does. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. It's like, yeah, she really does. That's how she goes into situations. And that anytime, you know, she would go in with a preconceived, particularly when dealing with the Bingleys and Darcy, with preconceived things that she would see and then she would judge. But she would also do that in general. She would go in with she would say desire, you know, she enjoys to laugh, but she also enjoys, to a certain extent, I think, to feel superior. Now, I think that got knocked out of her really hard with Darcy's letter, but she is a character who's very flawed, and I feel that once I saw that aspect of her, I looked at the character in a different way, and I couldn't just see her as this, oh, she's just sassy and strong. Well, I'm like, no, she has a definite flaw that, you know, is just as bad as Darcy's tendency to withdraw, and he has his own pride and snootiness where he kind of puts out others at distance, but she does it to a certain extent where she judges, but it doesn't necessarily come off as a snootiness. It's different, but she definitely judges, which yeah, it was interesting for me when I realized that. But anyway, so Anne and Fanny are very different than Lizzie. Actually, all of her heroines are different, but even Emma is more of your one that she kind of goes blazing across the page, and she, you know, is obviously in charge, controlling the situation badly sometimes, a lot of times. Yeah, but Anne doesn't necessarily need as big of a book as Fanny, because Fanny, you need to see her from the minute she came in and the abuse that she goes through, the psychological abuse that she goes through throughout her period of time as you see her growing through Mansfield Park, to see why she is the way she is and how her strength is so amazing. The kind of strength that she does have, even though it's not an obvious one to everybody. Whereas even though Anne is just as understated as a character, she does not need necessarily as big of a book, because for one thing, a lot of her stuff is interior anyway. It's not a lot of speech. It's a lot of in her own head. Whereas Fanny, yes, she's in her own head, but a lot of it is observing other people as well, and observing how other people treat her. For Anne, she's watching, but a lot of Anne is someone who she isn't treated well, but she isn't treated as poorly as Fanny, and she doesn't seem to need necessarily as much space to make it show how her strength is. I think a discerning reader can see pretty quickly especially after the issue at, no, it wasn't Brighton. It wasn't Bath either. Hold on. Not up across. Let's see. It was when they went on that, when they went to the seaside. Let's see. Lyme. So when they went to Lyme, I think Anne's, even though you could see Anne's strength throughout and like everyone kind of leaned on her, they would all talk to her, they would all lean on her for different things, but you saw her strength come through and how she dealt with emergencies later at Lyme. But I think because Anne was allowed to show very early on how people depended on our common sense. So you could see her strength very early on if you were a discerning reader. You didn't need a full book to kind of build up who the character was so you can find their strength. Whereas Fanny, no one cares what Fanny thinks. Even Edmund cares, but even Edmund doesn't completely get it. No one really cares what Fanny thinks. So Fanny, you don't get to see people depending on Fanny's strength because nobody acknowledges Fanny's strength. Even Edmund doesn't truly get Fanny's strength. So you need a much larger book to show how strong Fanny is versus Anne, who her strength is quite apparent early on, even though it's a subtle strength. The fact that everyone with any sense, or even people without sense, if you're looking at her sister Mary, do lean on her. Everyone but her father and her eldest sister Elizabeth, who just, they just kind of seem to always shuffle her off to the side. Most people do acknowledge that she has some sort of, she's intelligent, that she's common sense. Yeah, so you just don't need as big of a novel for that. I do like to think, though, that she and Eleanor from Sense Sensibility are quite similar in some ways. I think it's just Eleanor had more of a supportive family than Anne did. But yeah, this has gone a lot longer than I intended. This was just supposed to be talking about the book I really enjoyed and just finished, Maids, Wives, and Widows. So that, once again, I really recommend you read that. I'm going to turn this off now because the light is getting to me and it is quite late. But you have a very blessed, well, for me it's night, but you have a blessed whatever it happens to be for you. And I will see you next time. God bless. Bye.